Undercover boss orders parts at his garage. He stops cold. When a female employee cries in the back room. What happens when a boss walks into his own auto repair garage and discovers the truth behind every tightened bolt and polished smile? Thomas Reed, founder and boss of a small but beloved chain called Silverwood Auto Repair, had spent decades building his reputation on trust, a place where working-class families could bring their cars and know they'd be treated fairly. But lately, something felt off. Customer complaints about overpriced repairs and suspicious parts had been creeping in. Long-time employees were quitting. The reports Thomas received from his regional managers painted a different picture, a glowing one, but the rumors gnawed at him. Frustrated and unwilling to rely on second-hand words, Thomas decided to see for himself. He picked a modest Silverwood garage 2 towns over, far enough that few employees would recognize him. To blend in, Thomas ditched his pressed suits and designer shoes for an old pair of jeans, a faded work jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low. No one would guess he was the man whose name was stitched onto the company's very logo. As he pulled up in an aging pickup with a rattling engine, Thomas felt the weight of 2 decades of work pressing on his shoulders. He wasn't here just to check on operations. He was here to find out. Was the soul of Silverwood still alive? Or had it been pawned off piece by piece while he wasn't looking? Of all the garages Thomas had built, Silverwood Auto Repair was the one he had loved most. It wasn't the biggest or the most profitable, but it had heart. It was supposed to be the kind of place where a single mom could bring in her old sedan and know no one would take advantage of her, or where an old-timer with a pickup could shoot the breeze over coffee while getting a fair deal. But now, standing in the middle of the lobby under the buzzing fluorescent lights, Thomas felt a knot form in his gut. The place looked the same, the polished floor tiles, the familiar smell of rubber and machine oil. But there was a weight to the air. Not tension exactly, something more insidious. Like the walls themselves were tired of pretending. Emma greeted him at the counter, a clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. She had that kindness in her voice, the kind that wasn't faked, the kind that couldn't be taught. Her hair was tucked into a messy bun, and despite the smile she offered, Thomas caught the flicker of weariness in her eyes. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you today?" she asked, polite, but a little rushed. Thomas adjusted the brim of his old baseball cap, the one he wore when he didn't want to be noticed. "Truck's been making a weird knocking noise. Figure it's time someone took a look." Emma nodded, scribbling a few notes. "We'll get you set up. Shouldn't be too long." As she processed the paperwork, Thomas took the opportunity to scan the room. A few customers sat hunched in the waiting area, tapping their phones or flipping through magazines without really reading. No one smiled. No one chatted. It felt like a doctor's office, but without the hope. From the back garage bay, Thomas heard it. A voice, loud and sharp, cutting through the hum of work. "Emma, you didn't push the premium package on the guy with the Honda. That's another upsell missed." Victor's voice. Thomas didn't flinch. He recognized that kind of voice anywhere. He'd dealt with men like Victor before, bullies who disguised pressure tactics as leadership. Emma stiffened, just for a heartbeat, then forced a breath through her nose and smiled tightly at Thomas. "Excuse me 1 second," she said, before ducking around the corner. Thomas wandered casually toward the hallway that led to the bays. From there, he could hear more clearly. "I told you, we need to hit our numbers. Nobody cares if his brakes are fine. You sell him the gold package, understand?" "I can't," Emma said softly. "I won't sell people things they don't need." Victor laughed, a short, ugly bark of sound. "You think your opinion matters? You want to keep working here, sweetheart, you learn to play the game." Thomas's jaw tensed. He pretended to examine a rack of windshield wipers, listening. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement in the garage. Ben, the old mechanic, was wiping his hands on a rag, watching the confrontation with the detached sorrow of a man who'd seen too many battles lost before they even started. Thomas's chest tightened. Ben had been with Silverwood almost from the start. A man who could rebuild an engine blindfolded. A man who once told Thomas that in this business, trust was the most valuable tool you could own, and the easiest one to break. Thomas turned back to the counter just as Emma reappeared, her face composed, but her knuckles white where she gripped her clipboard. "Sorry about that," she said lightly. "Let's get your truck checked in." He gave her a nod, his voice steady. "Take your time." As she worked, Thomas pulled a small leather notebook from his jacket pocket, making a few discreet notes. Upselling pressure, disrespect to staff, atmosphere, tense, fearful. He tucked the notebook away before Emma could see. He didn't want her to think he was judging her. Far from it. Outside in the garage, he watched as Victor swaggered between bays, barking orders, barely glancing at the cars he supposedly cared about. He shoved a clipboard at Ben, who took it without a word. Nearby, a younger mechanic, probably not even 25, fumbled with a tire rotation, his hands shaking slightly as Victor loomed over him. Thomas leaned against the wall, pretending to check a flyer about winter tune-ups. He felt the old anger rising in his blood, not just for himself, not even just for Silverwood, but for every person who had ever trusted someone like Victor with their hard-earned money, only to be betrayed. He didn't want to blow his cover yet, not until he was sure, not until he had seen enough. Emma returned with a copy of the work order, her smile fragile but genuine. "One of our senior techs, Ben, will take a look. Shouldn't be too long." Thomas glanced toward the bay, where Ben was already popping the hood of the battered old pickup. "Good man, Ben," Thomas said casually. Emma's face softened, just a fraction. "Yeah, one of the best." And that tiny flicker of warmth told Thomas everything he needed to know. There were still good people here, people worth fighting for. He tucked his hands in his pockets and settled onto one of the cracked vinyl chairs to wait. But he wasn't just waiting for his truck. He was waiting for the right moment, because something was broken at Silverwood. And Thomas Reed was done sitting by while someone else broke it even further. Thomas didn't have to wait long. The crack in the system was wider than he thought, and it showed itself faster than expected. As he sat pretending to scroll through his phone, he heard another confrontation erupt. But this time, it wasn't Victor shouting. It was Emma. Her voice, low but firm, carried enough edge that Thomas immediately looked up. "I'm not going to lie to customers, Victor," she said, standing near the service counter where an elderly man with a walking cane waited patiently. "Mr. Harris's brakes are fine. He doesn't need replacements." Victor, arms crossed, leaned in close enough to make it intimidating. His voice was a stage whisper, sharp enough to slice skin. "We don't ask if they need it, Emma. We sell. Got it? You want to stay here? You hit your quota." Thomas could see Emma's hands trembling slightly as she clutched the customer's paperwork. Mr. Harris shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension. Thomas could tell the man wasn't sure what he was buying anymore, just that he probably didn't trust it. That was the moment Thomas stood. Not with a shout, not with a scene. Quietly, deliberately, he stepped toward the counter. "Excuse me," he said, aiming his words at Victor but his gaze at Emma. "I had a question about my work order." Emma turned, almost grateful for the interruption. "Of course, sir," she said, smoothing the paperwork and pulling her professionalism back over her like armor. As Emma explained something minor about the tire rotation, Thomas saw the way Victor's jaw tensed. A predator denied his prey, at least for now. Thomas let Emma finish, nodding politely, then casually added, "Also, I was wondering, do you offer service recommendations based on actual inspections or sales quotas?" Emma's eyes widened slightly. But Victor cut in with a forced laugh. "We always offer our customers the best options available." Thomas smiled thinly. "Good to know." He leaned closer to Emma and lowered his voice, just enough for her to hear. "Don't let them make you forget why you started." Emma blinked rapidly, swallowing hard. For a second, Thomas thought she might break down right there, but she didn't. She just nodded once, the smallest, most defiant gesture he'd seen all day. Victor, sensing he was losing control of the situation, retreated to the back, barking something about checking stock numbers. Thomas returned to his seat, heart pounding. He wasn't here to blow the lid off everything yet. No, not yet. But he'd made his first move. He let the good ones know. They weren't alone. He watched from the corner as Ben shuffled over to the counter to collect a parts slip. The old mechanic gave Emma a look. Not a smile exactly, but a nod of quiet approval. The kind of look that said, "I saw that." Good job. And Thomas realized the battle for Silverwood wasn't going to be fought with speeches. It would be fought in 100 tiny moments just like this. Moments where people chose either to cave or to stand. He tapped his notebook again, making a new note. Emma, resisting pressure to upsell. Ben, silent supporter. Victor, aggressive quota enforcement. Then he wrote a single word under it: culture. Because this wasn't just about one bad manager. This was a culture that had allowed rot to grow, while people like Emma and Ben struggled to hold on to the reasons they fell in love with this work in the first place. Thomas knew the hard part wasn't firing one guy. The hard part would be rebuilding what had been quietly destroyed: trust, pride, decency. He glanced over at Emma once more, saw the way she squared her shoulders, and smiled at the next customer. Maybe it wasn't too late. Not if he moved fast. Not if he stood with the right people and against the wrong ones. As he sat back down, the overhead bell jingled, and another customer came in, laughing about his battered old Jeep. Emma greeted him with real warmth. Not the fake kind Victor would have preferred, but the kind Thomas had always dreamed Silverwood could represent. He allowed himself a small, private smile. There was still something here worth saving. And Thomas Reed was just getting started. By the time the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the shop floor, Thomas knew it was time. He had seen enough. Silverwood Auto wasn't broken because the cars were bad. It was broken because good people had been taught to stay quiet, while the loudest, most ruthless voices ran unchecked. And Victor had been shouting the loudest of all. The final crack came when a young couple, maybe in their late 20s, walked in, holding hands nervously. Their minivan had been making a strange sound, and they needed a simple diagnostic. Thomas sat up a little straighter, watching. Emma greeted them warmly, taking notes carefully. Ben, with his oil-stained hands and quiet efficiency, rolled the van into a bay. Everything looked normal, until Victor appeared. He swooped in fast, clipboard in hand, all smiles for the customers. The couple barely had time to explain their worries before Victor was rattling off a list. Transmission flush, radiator replacement, brake pad upgrades. I recommend the premium line for safety. Oh, and a fuel system cleaning too. Special bundle deal. Thomas felt his stomach knot. The price Victor quoted was almost double what the van was worth. Emma tried to speak. Thomas could see it. She stepped forward, voice tentative. Actually, after a basic inspection, it looks like it's just a loose heat shield under the exhaust. Pretty minor. Victor cut her off sharply, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. You're not a mechanic, Emma. Let's leave the real assessments to the professionals, shall we? Ben looked like he wanted to throw a wrench across the room. Thomas's hands tightened around his notebook. Enough. He stood, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. He walked slowly across the waiting area, past the rows of tires, past the gleaming posters advertising Silverwood's trusted service since 1998. He stopped right next to the confused young couple, who were clutching each other now, sensing something wasn't right. Thomas turned, locked eyes with Victor. Then, without breaking his gaze, he pulled out his wallet and flipped open his company ID. The room seemed to freeze. "My name is Thomas Reed," he said, voice calm but resonant. "I'm the owner and founder of Silverwood Auto Repair." Victor blinked. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. "You," Thomas continued, "have been lying to my customers, pressuring my staff, corrupting the very thing we built here." Victor stammered, desperate now. "Look, I didn't mean, it's just business, sir, it's—" Thomas cut him off with a wave of his hand. It's greed, dressed up in a company logo. He turned to Emma, who stood frozen, eyes wide with disbelief. "Emma," he said gently, "would you mind bringing Mr. and Mrs. Green their real service assessment? No bundles, no pressure, just the truth." Emma nodded so quickly it was almost a bow and rushed off to grab the report Ben had prepared. Thomas faced Victor again. "We'll finish this conversation inside," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The authority in it was absolute. Victor sagged, in front of the staff, in front of the customers, his kingdom of fear crumbling right where he stood. Thomas led him toward the office, feeling every pair of eyes in the shop following them. As the door closed behind them, the waiting room slowly came back to life. Customers murmuring, mechanics exchanging glances. Emma returned a moment later, handing the couple a much smaller, much cheaper repair estimate. They smiled at her like she was a lifesaver. Thomas watched from the office window. This was what Silverwood had always meant to be. Not a place where fear ruled. Not a place where profit mattered more than people. He turned back to Victor, who stood stiffly in front of the desk, sweating under the cheap fluorescent lights. Victor was the first to speak, voice tight. "You know," he said bitterly, "this is ridiculous. I've been keeping this place afloat while you sit comfy in your fancy office." Thomas didn't blink. He just watched him. Victor jabbed a finger in the air. "You think these customers are easy? They're clueless. You gotta sell them the extras or we don't make numbers." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You call lying making numbers? It's business," Victor snapped. "Survival." "You wouldn't understand. You're not down here every day." Thomas leaned in, voice cold. "And who do you think put you down here?" "I trusted you to run this place right, with integrity." Victor scoffed. "Integrity doesn't pay rent, boss. Upsells do." Thomas shook his head slowly. "You don't stab your customers and call it a business model." Victor's face turned a shade redder. "I did what had to be done," he muttered. Thomas stood fully now, towering over him. "What had to be done," he repeated, "is treating people with honesty, respect, like we promised when we opened this damn place." Victor opened his mouth to fire back, but Thomas stopped him cold. "No more speeches, no more lies." He stepped around the desk, closer now, so Victor could see there would be no second chance. "You're finished. Effective immediately." Victor's mouth worked silently for a moment, like he still wanted to argue, but the fight had gone out of him. Thomas stepped back, letting the weight of those words land. Then he pointed at the door. "Go." Victor stood there a beat longer, deflated. Then he turned, pushing the door open and slinking back onto the floor, past the silent, watching faces of the mechanics, past Emma's steady gaze. Thomas stayed in the office a moment longer, breathing deeply. This had to be the beginning, not the end. Outside the glass, the workshop buzzed again, but softer now, steadier. Thomas looked out and thought, now we rebuild. The shop had finally settled into a strange, delicate hush. Victor was gone. The customers were being helped. But Thomas knew just firing a man didn't heal the wounds he left behind. It was time to face the ones who had stayed, the ones who had been trying to hold Silverwood together while no one was watching. He stepped out of the office and caught Emma's eye. She flinched slightly, still half expecting to be blamed, perhaps, but Thomas simply nodded toward the small break room in the back. Ben looked up from where he was wiping down his tools. Thomas met his gaze, too. "You too, Ben," he said quietly. "Please." They followed him, unsure but willing. Inside the cramped break room, walls lined with old event posters, the hum of a cheap fridge filling the silence, Thomas motioned for them to sit. He remained standing. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Thomas looked at Emma first. Her hands were clasped tightly together on the table, knuckles white. Ben sat beside her, arms crossed, jaw set tight. The kind of tired you didn't fix with a day off. Thomas cleared his throat. "I owe you both an apology," he said finally. Emma's head jerked up in surprise. "I should have been here sooner," Thomas continued. His voice was low, steady. "I should have seen what was happening before it got this bad." Ben let out a soft, almost imperceptible grunt, not angry, just worn down. Thomas turned to Emma. "You tried to protect our customers," he said, "and you got punished for it. I'm sorry." Emma's lip quivered, just barely. She shook her head quickly, blinking hard. "I wasn't looking for thanks," she said hoarsely. "I just didn't want us to become one of those places. You know, the ones people warn their friends about." Her voice cracked a little. "I love working here. I love helping people. I didn't want to be part of something I couldn't be proud of." Thomas swallowed against the tightness rising in his chest. Ben spoke next, his voice rough from years of speaking over roaring engines. "When I started at Silverwood, it meant something," he said. "We fixed the cars right. We treated people right. That was the whole damn point." He looked Thomas dead in the eye. "You remember that, boss?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I remember." Ben leaned back, letting out a tired sigh. "Somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like that." Emma stared down at the table, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some days, it felt like it didn't matter how hard we tried. As long as someone else was making numbers look good." Thomas felt that like a gut punch, because it was true. He had started chasing numbers, growth reports, expansion meetings, margins, and somewhere between the 5th and 15th new location, he had lost sight of why he had started in the first place. He hadn't built Silverwood for profits. He had built it because he believed people deserved a garage they could trust. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling. "I failed you," Thomas said simply. "I failed this place." Emma shook her head again, fiercely this time. "Number, you're here now," she said. "That's what matters." Ben gave a gruff nod. "Yeah, could have just stayed comfy behind the desk. Could have let it rot." Thomas smiled faintly, the first real smile he'd felt all day. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. He leaned in a little closer across the table. "We're going to fix this, together." He outlined his plan. No pressure sales, better staffing, real service standards coming back, rewarding the people who actually gave a damn. Emma listened, her eyes growing a little wider with every word. Ben just grunted once, approval, and cracked his knuckles like a man preparing to rebuild something with his own two hands. When Thomas finally sat back, the silence in the room had shifted. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was hopeful. And when Emma looked up at him, her smile small, cautious, but real, Thomas felt it settle deep in his chest. This was why he had built Silverwood. Not for margins, not for market share, for people like Emma, for people like Ben. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to bring it all back. Thomas stood, offering his hand first to Emma, then to Ben. "Let's get to work," he said. Their grips were firm. Outside the break room, the garage hummed with the soft sounds of honest labor. The kind of music Thomas realized he hadn't really heard in a long, long time. And for the first time in months, maybe years, he believed, Silverwood Auto wasn't just repairable, it was worth saving. The air inside Silverwood felt heavier after Victor's exit, like a storm had just broken and left the earth damp but strangely clean. Thomas stood in the middle of the service bay, surrounded by the scattered echoes of what had just happened. Mechanics stole glances at him, unsure whether to hope or brace for another blow. He didn't make them wait long. "Everyone," Thomas called out, his voice steady, carrying not just authority but something rarer, sincerity. "Can I have a moment?" The hum of tools quieted. Wrenches were set down. Heads turned. Emma slipped out from behind the counter, standing a little apart, still clutching a clipboard like a shield. Ben leaned against a support pillar, arms folded, but watching with a cautious optimism that Thomas didn't miss. Thomas took a breath. "For too long," he said, scanning the faces of the people who kept Silverwood running. "We let the wrong priorities take over." He paused, letting that truth land. "I started this business to offer honest repairs, real service, a place where you wouldn't have to wonder if someone was lying to you the second you stepped through the door." He caught Emma's eye. She blinked quickly, almost like she didn't want to believe it yet. "But somewhere along the line," Thomas continued, voice softening, "we let numbers replace trust. We rewarded pressure instead of integrity, and we made good people feel like they didn't belong." The floor was silent. Even the clocks ticking above the garage bays seemed to slow. "That ends today." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Thomas pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket and opened it. "Here's what's happening. Effective immediately." He ticked the points off, one by one, voice unwavering. "No more upsell quotas tied to your paychecks. Your worth is not measured in how many parts you can push onto a customer." A ripple of surprise, and something like cautious relief, moved through the group. "We're hiring additional techs to relieve the insane overtime some of you have been pulling. No more being asked to do the job of 3 people for the paycheck of 1. Ben's eyebrows rose. He shifted his weight, arms uncrossing slightly. "We're setting a new standard for promotions and bonuses, based entirely on service quality, customer satisfaction, and teamwork, not raw revenue." He turned to Emma now, singling her out. "And starting next week, Emma will be stepping into a new role, service quality supervisor across all Silverwood branches." Emma blinked as if he had just spoken a different language. I don't," she stammered, looking down at the clipboard in her hands. "You earned it," Thomas said simply. "Not by selling the most, by refusing to sell out your integrity." He let that sit for a moment. "This isn't a temporary patch," Thomas said finally, folding the paper back into his jacket. "This is the new foundation. And if anyone here thinks cutting corners, bullying coworkers, or hustling customers is still how we operate," his voice cooled, sharpening to a blade, "you're in the wrong place." Silence. Then, a slow, tentative thud of someone starting to clap. Ben. Emma's eyes widened, but Ben kept clapping, slower, louder, until a few others joined in. Then more. It wasn't a roaring applause. It was something better. It was real. Thomas allowed himself a small smile, inclining his head slightly in thanks. He didn't need their cheers. He needed their belief. And judging by the way Emma finally smiled, not out of fear, not out of habit, but because hope was beginning to slip back into her, he knew he was on the right track. Silverwood wasn't fixed yet, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't broken beyond repair either. And Thomas would fight to keep it that way, no matter what storms might still be waiting on the horizon. For a brief moment, Silverwood Auto breathed easier. The days following Victor's removal felt lighter, like the first spring air after a long, choking winter. Emma smiled more. Ben joked with the younger techs again. Even customers seemed to linger longer, sipping coffee in the waiting area, chatting about things other than car trouble. But peace, Thomas knew, was fragile, and some storms you didn't see coming. It started innocently enough. A scheduled compliance audit, the kind Thomas had ordered himself as part of the new transparency standards. The auditors arrived with laptops and clipboards, efficient and polite, combing through Silverwood's inventory records. At first, Thomas barely paid attention. He was too busy training the new hires, sitting in on service calls, and reworking their advertising to focus on honesty over deals. Then Janet, his longtime assistant, knocked softly on his office door. "Thomas," she said, her voice low, "you need to see this." He followed her down the hall to a back room where the auditors had set up. One of them, a young woman named Camille, looked up from her screen, her expression carefully neutral. "We've found some discrepancies," she said. "Parts inventory. A few batches of brake pads, filters, and alternators logged under Emma Carson's shift, but missing invoices." Thomas frowned, unsettled. "That can't be right," he said automatically. Camille shrugged, professional but not unkind. "I'm sure there's an explanation, but protocol says we flag it for investigation." He rubbed the back of his neck. Missing invoices, under Emma's name. A cold pit opened in his stomach. Could it really be her? Before he could speak again, another auditor leaned over, murmuring something to Camille. She nodded, then turned back to Thomas. "And some of the tech staff have raised concerns anonymously. They allege Emma may have been selling parts off the books, pocketing cash." Thomas felt like the room tilted slightly. Ben's warning came back to him like a ghost. The ones who care the most, they're the first ones that the old system tries to crush. He forced himself to stay calm. "Who raised those concerns?" he asked quietly. Camille glanced down at her notes. "Names withheld, per policy, but the timing lines up with the missing stock entries." Thomas clenched his jaw. He already had a feeling. Not the new techs. They barely knew Emma. Number it would be the remnants. The ones still loyal to Victor's way of doing business. The ones he hadn't rooted out yet. Still, procedures were procedures. By the end of the day, under intense pressure from the corporate legal team, Thomas had no choice but to call Emma into the office. She arrived 5 minutes later, cheeks flushed from the cold wind outside, still in her work apron. She clutched a clipboard against her chest like armor. She saw the auditors sitting along the wall. She saw the empty chair waiting across from Thomas. Her face paled, but she didn't falter. "Have a seat, Emma," Thomas said, hating how formal he sounded. She obeyed without a word. Thomas folded his hands together on the desk. "There have been allegations," he said slowly. "Inventory discrepancies tied to your shifts." Emma's lips parted in shock. I don't understand," she whispered. He steeled himself. "Until the investigation is completed," he continued, "we're required to place you on temporary suspension." It felt like shoving a knife into his own chest. Emma sat very still for a moment, processing. Then she nodded once, slowly, almost imperceptibly. "I understand," she said, voice low but clear. "I didn't take anything. I didn't cheat anyone." Thomas believed her. Everything in him screamed that she was telling the truth. But policy was policy. Until he had proof, belief wasn't enough. Emma rose from her seat. Before she turned to go, she paused, glancing back. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, and for the first time since Thomas had known her, her voice trembled. "I'm not good at defending myself. Never have I been. I just try to do the right thing, quietly." She hesitated, then finished. "If that's not enough anymore, I'm sorry." And then she was gone. Thomas sat in the silence, feeling hollow. He could still smell the scent of oil and cold air she left behind. Across the room, one of the auditors quietly shut their laptop, giving Thomas a polite, professional nod. But Thomas barely noticed. In his mind, all he could see was Emma's small, proud figure walking away from the place she had fought so hard to protect. And for the first time in a long, long time, Thomas wasn't sure if the good guys were going to win. The next morning, Silverwood Auto opened without Emma. The front desk felt empty without her quick, steady hands shuffling paperwork. Ben worked in near silence, the easy jokes gone from the air. Customers seemed more guarded too, picking up on the invisible tension. Thomas hated it. But worse than the silence was the doubt gnawing at him. What if he had been wrong? What if Emma, bright, stubborn Emma, wasn't the person he thought she was? The thought clung to him like oil under fingernails. By noon, Thomas couldn't sit still any longer. He called Janet into his office. "I want the footage," he said. Janet blinked. "Footage?" "From the parts room cameras," he clarified. "The ones from the past 2 months?" Janet hesitated. "Sir, those old cameras, they're grainy. Half of them glitch." Thomas shook his head firmly. "Doesn't matter. I want every second pulled, no shortcuts." Janet nodded and disappeared. An hour later, Thomas sat in the darkened back room, staring at the flickering screen. It was painful work, pixelated black and white footage, sometimes skipping frames. But he forced himself to watch, minute by minute, hour by hour. Most of it was boring. Texts coming and going, boxes of parts shuffled around, invoices being scribbled hastily. Then, late one night 2 weeks ago, something strange. Thomas leaned closer. 3 mechanics, not Emma, slipping into the stockroom after hours. They weren't supposed to be there without a manager's sign-off. On the screen, he saw them open sealed shipments, swap out boxes, and fiddle with the logs. One of them, Thomas squinted, wore a Silverwood cap pulled low. And when they were done, they logged the inventory under Emma's shift. Her name, her ID badge. Thomas rewound it again and again, feeling the rage boil inside him. It wasn't Emma. It had never been Emma. It was the remnants of Victor's old team, the ones who had smiled too quickly when Thomas announced the changes, the ones who had stayed quiet when Emma was suspended. Sabotage, a cold, calculated betrayal. Thomas pushed away from the monitor, heart pounding. He didn't wait. Within the hour, he called an emergency staff meeting. The techs shuffled into the service bay awkwardly, murmuring among themselves. Some glanced at Thomas with thinly veiled suspicion. Others, Ben included, simply looked tired. Thomas waited until the last person arrived. Then he stepped forward, holding up a flash drive between 2 fingers. "This," he said quietly, "is the truth." The room fell silent. "I've reviewed the footage," Thomas continued, voice steady but sharp as a blade. "Every missing part, every mistake that was pinned on Emma Carson." He let that hang in the air. "And I saw who really did it." A few techs shifted nervously. One, a lanky guy named Trevor, wouldn't meet his eye. Thomas kept going. "For too long, this shop protected people who were willing to lie, cheat, and throw others under the bus. That ends today." He pulled a list from his pocket, a short list, 3 names. Trevor Mason, Kyle Denton, Luis Alvarez. "Pack your things. You're terminated immediately for misconduct, breach of trust, and falsifying inventory records." Trevor opened his mouth, but Thomas was faster. "No appeals. No debates. Get out." Security escorted the 3 stunned men out of the building. Thomas turned back to the remaining staff. "And for the rest of you," he said, his voice softening just slightly, "let today be clear. Silverwood Auto will be a place where good work matters, where honesty matters, not politics, not shortcuts, not fear." He looked around the room, at Ben, at the younger techs, at the new hires who watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. "And if you ever feel pressured to betray that again," Thomas said, "my door is open. Always." He ended the meeting there. No applause, no cheers. Just a heavy, necessary silence, the sound of roots digging deep into the earth again after a long storm. Later that afternoon, Thomas called Emma. She answered on the first ring, her voice tense. "Mr. Reed?" Thomas smiled, small but genuine. "Emma," he said, "come back to Silverwood." A pause, a breathless, stunned pause. "You mean?" "I mean," Thomas said, "you were right. About everything. And we need you here more than ever." He heard a soft noise, almost like a sob, before she cleared her throat quickly. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," she said. Thomas hung up, staring out the window at the Silverwood sign gleaming in the late afternoon sun. He knew now. Justice didn't happen by accident. It wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. It was a fight, every single time. But today, at least, Silverwood had won back a piece of its soul. And tomorrow? Tomorrow they would begin again. The next morning, the sun climbed over Silverwood Auto, casting long golden streaks across the lot. But inside the garage, something deeper was shifting. Not the metal, not the oil, the people. Emma walked through the front door just before opening time, her shoulders straight but her fingers trembling slightly around the strap of her bag. The room froze when they saw her. Ben was the first to move. He wiped his hands on a rag and crossed the lobby in 3 long strides. Without a word, he held out his hand. Emma stared at it for a heartbeat, then smiled, small and real, and shook it firmly. The air loosened after that. A few mechanics gave her quick nods. Janet waved shyly from behind the front desk. They didn't know exactly what had happened behind the scenes, only that Emma was here. And that mattered more than anything. Thomas watched it all from his office window, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands. He didn't interfere, didn't make a speech. He understood now. Real respect wasn't demanded. It was earned, quietly, stubbornly, by standing back up when others tried to knock you down. By mid-morning, Silverwood was humming again. Ben was under a Ford pickup, his voice floating from beneath the chassis as he instructed a new trainee. Emma worked the parts counter, explaining different brake pads to an elderly customer without pushing a single unnecessary upgrade. Janet organized work orders with a focus that Thomas hadn't seen in months. Even the new techs, younger, fresher, moved with a certain ease, no longer looking over their shoulders. Thomas couldn't help smiling. For the first time in too long, Silverwood didn't feel like a machine grinding down the people inside it. It felt like a team again. He stepped out into the lobby just in time to see something small, something important. A little boy, no older than 6, was tugging on his mother's hand, pointing excitedly at a wall display of shiny hubcaps. Emma knelt beside him, laughing softly, letting him pick one up to admire, even though she had invoices waiting. Thomas caught the mother's grateful smile, the boy's delighted chatter. Not a big thing, just a moment. But it was everything. He turned back toward his office, heart lighter. That afternoon, he called a full team meeting, not because there was a crisis, not because he needed to scold or fix anything, but because he needed them to hear it, clearly, directly from him. When everyone had gathered, some with grease still smudged on their forearms, Thomas stood at the center of the bay and spoke. "No posters, no slogans," he said simply. "Just this." He paused. "We fix cars," he said, "but more importantly, we fix trust." Silence. He pressed on, voice steady. "Silverwood isn't just about machines. It's about the people who trust us to get them home safe, to not take advantage of them when they're scared or confused, to be honest, even when it would be easier not to be." He looked around, at Emma, at Ben, at the new faces, and he saw it, the way their backs straightened, the way their eyes sharpened. They understood. Thomas smiled. "And if anyone ever makes you choose between doing what's right and doing what's easy," he said, "you already know which one wins." A low ripple of nods spread through the group. Ben crossed his arms, a small, approving grunt rumbling from his chest. Emma's eyes shone, not with tears, but with a fierceness that hadn't been there before. Thomas finished quietly. We're not just fixing Silverwood. We're rebuilding what it means to work here. And that starts with you. He let the words hang there, no rush to fill the silence, before giving a final nod. All right, he said. Let's get back to work. The team dispersed, but this time, they didn't scatter like leaves in a storm. They moved together, talking, planning, already working like a crew with a common purpose. Thomas lingered a moment longer, letting it sink in. The betrayal, the anger, the doubt. They hadn't broken Silverwood. They had strengthened it, because now every person left standing knew exactly what they were fighting for, and what they would never again allow to be corrupted. Later that evening, as the last customer drove off and the shop lights dimmed, Thomas found himself at the front counter. Emma was there, tidying up the last work orders. He cleared his throat. She looked up, wary at first, then relaxed when she saw it was just him. Thomas smiled. Tough first day back? He asked lightly. Emma laughed under her breath, tucking a stray hair behind her ear. Not so bad. He leaned against the counter, voice softer now. You know, he said, I used to think running a shop like this was all about the systems, the inventory, the workflow. Emma said nothing, just watched him, patiently. But I was wrong, Thomas continued. Systems matter, but people are what save a place when everything else falls apart. Emma smiled, small, tired, but genuine. Thomas straightened, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small box, simple, no frills. Inside was a new name tag. Emma Carson, Lead Service Advisor, Silverwood Auto Repair. Emma stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked up, blinking fast. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Thomas chuckled. You don't have to say anything, he said. You already did, the moment you refused to give up. She took the badge carefully, almost reverently, and for a moment there was nothing in the world except two people, battered, exhausted, but still standing. Still building something better. One wrench, one car, one honest conversation at a time. Silverwood had survived, and tomorrow it would thrive. As Thomas flipped the front sign to closed, he paused by the door for a moment. Outside, the lot was quiet. Inside, the faint smell of motor oil and clean metal lingered. Familiar, but somehow different. Silverwood hadn't just survived a scandal. It had survived forgetting itself and clawed its way back, not through slogans or numbers or some flashy corporate memo, but through people. People who chose honesty when it would have been easier to look the other way. People who stood up even when their voices shook. Thomas smiled to himself as he locked the door. He finally understood something he wished he had learned years earlier. A business isn't defined by the machines it fixes or the profits it counts. It's defined by the character of the people who refuse to let it lose its soul. Maybe it's the quiet victories that matter most, not the big speeches, not the headlines, but the simple, stubborn decision, day after day, to do the right thing, even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. And maybe that's what real leadership looks like too. Leading by protecting, leading by believing, leading by staying, even when it's hard, until the good outweighs the broken. So if you believe that honesty still matters, if you believe that doing the right thing is still worth it, even when no one cheers for it, then this story was for you, and there are more stories like this waiting to be told. If you don't want to miss them, if you want to keep seeing real moments where heart and courage still win, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us here at this channel, because the world needs more reminders that integrity isn't dead. It just needs someone like you to keep it alive. See you in the next story.